You know the shape a Cobra cuts against the road, even if you never knew it was built by a British firm called AC Cars. Low, wide, impossibly aggressive, the most replicated car silhouette on Earth, and the star of a film that won 2 Academy Awards. Every single one began its life in a quiet Surrey village called Thames Ditton, hand-formed in aluminium, then shipped across the Atlantic to have a monstrous American engine dropped in. AC had built cars by that river since 1911. It survived 2 world wars and the Depression. It survived the death of the very engine its finest car depended on. It even survived being handed the fastest, most frightening machine of its age. And then, after 75 years by the water, the works fell silent, and the name it built was split down the middle of the Atlantic. How does the firm that built the most famous sports car on Earth simply vanish? What really happened at Thames Ditton? Chapter 1. The Balloon Factory by the Thames. There's a stretch of the river just opposite Hampton Court where the water runs slow and green, where the houses are expensive and the pubs do a good Sunday lunch, and where nothing at all suggests that one of the most violent motorcars ever built was born a few hundred yards from the towpath. This is Thames Ditton in Surrey. It is, by any measure, one of the gentlest places in England. And the story of how a monster came out of it begins, as so many good stories do, with a butcher who didn't much like risk. The engineer was John Weller. Born in Peckham in 1877, he was one of those restless, late Victorian men who looked at a horse and cart and saw an insult to the age. By 1901, he'd set up in West Norwood, in South London, building a motor car of his own design. It was clever. It was, by the standards of the day, rather beautiful. And it was going nowhere because clever and beautiful cost money, and Weller didn't have any. The money came from John Portwine. Portwine ran a chain of meat stores across South London, the London and suburban meat stores, a solid, unglamorous business that had made him a solid, unglamorous fortune. In 1902, he backed Weller, and the 2 men formed a company. It should have been the beginning of a great English motor car. It very nearly wasn't. Weller's showpiece was a 20-horsepower touring car, and he unveiled it at the Crystal Palace Motor Show in 1903. It drew admiring glances. It drew almost no orders. Portwine, who understood ledgers the way Weller understood engines, looked at what the thing cost to build and delivered the verdict that would shape everything that followed. Too expensive. Nobody would buy it. Build something small. Build something useful. Build something that pays. So Weller, the man who wanted to build a great car, built a delivery van instead. It was a little 3-wheeler, 1-cylinder, chain drive, a box on the front for a tradesman's goods, and they called it the auto carrier. It was ugly and honest, and it sold. Around 1,500 of them went out onto Edwardian streets, carrying meat and milk and parcels, and the profit from those homely little machines kept the dream alive. Then, in 1907, came a passenger version. They called it the AC Sociable, and those 2 letters, A and C for auto carriers, would outlive the men, the town, and very nearly the century. In 1911, the firm became Auto Carriers Limited and made the move that fixed its home for the next 75 years, across the river to Thames Ditton. The famous circular AC badge dates from here, and when the Great War came, the works turned to shells and fuses, as engineering firms did, and came out the other side of it with cash and confidence. In 1919, they bought an old balloon factory on the Thames Ditton High Street. Remember that. A company that would one day build a car worth more than most streets started life in a shed where they'd once made balloons. That same year, 1919, Weller finally got to be the engineer he'd always wanted to be. He designed an overhead camshaft, straight-six engine. Advanced, smooth, jewel-like, and it was so good, so fundamentally right, that AC kept building it until 1963. 44 years. There are people who say it was the second longest-lived production engine in history, beaten only by the Volkswagen Flat 4. Weller drew it as a young man, and it was still turning over in cars when he was long dead. But being right about engineering has never been the same thing as being safe. In 1921, a new man bought his way in. Selwyn Edge, a hard-charging former Napier man who lived for records and racing and headlines. Edge and the founders did not get along. Within a year, Weller and Portwine were gone, resigned, pushed out of the company they'd built. In 1927, Edge bought the whole thing outright for £135,000, an enormous sum, renamed it, and set about spending. Then the world fell over. The crash of 1929 took the market, took the orders, and took Edge with it. By 1930, the company was in voluntary liquidation, and Selwyn Edge, who had paid £135,000 for it, is said to have lost the lot. AC was finished. It had been building cars, on and off, for a quarter of a century. And now it was just a name, a badge, and a shed full of parts by a quiet river. It needed rescuing, and rescue, when it came, arrived entirely by accident. Chapter 2. The Savile Row of Motordom. The men who saved AC never meant to build a single car. They were the Hurlock brothers, William, always known as Will, born in 1887, and Charles, 14 years younger, born in 1901. They ran a road haulage and vehicle refurbishment business, and what they wanted, when they picked over the corpse of AC in 1930, was the building. The old High Street Works would make a fine warehouse. That was the plan. Buy the premises, use the space, ignore the cars. But the works came with a service depot that was still, somehow, alive, and a stock of parts and part-finished cars sitting quietly on the floor. It seemed a waste, so the Hurlocks assembled around 50 motor cars out of what was lying about, more or less to tidy up. And then Will Hurlock did the thing that changed everything. He took one of the finished cars home for himself. He drove it, and he liked it. That was it. That was the whole grand strategic decision. A man enjoyed his own product, and so a car company that had died came quietly back to life. Will became managing director, Charles general manager, and the two of them settled on a way of doing business that suited a small firm run by careful men. They would not chase volume. They would not fight the big manufacturers on price. Instead, they'd take proven, reliable mechanical parts and wrap them in whatever bodywork the customer wanted, built by hand, one at a time. They advertised it beautifully. Tailor-made, they said, at the Savile Row of Motordom. And that was exactly the register. A small, proud, expensive house selling craftsmanship to people who could afford it. Through the 1930s, they built fewer than 100 cars a year, and they built them well, and they survived. Into this world in 1939 came a young man named Derek Hurlock. Will's nephew, educated at Dulwich College, he joined the family firm just as the world was about to catch fire. He spent the war in the Royal Navy from 1942 to 1946, came home, became a director in 1947, and by the end of the decade was effectively running the place. He would run it for the next 40 years. He is the man who signs off, decades from now, on the deal that makes AC immortal, and the same man who, much later, with his health failing, personally calls a halt. Keep hold of Derek Hurlock. His whole life is bound up in this one small factory by the river. The war changed the works, as it changed everything. The peacetime firm had employed around 140 people. By the height of the fighting, turning out munitions and engineering for the war effort, that number had swollen to about 630. Then peace came. The soldiers came home, and by 1949 AC was building motorcars again at a rate of roughly 250 a year, a good rate for a firm that measured its work in individual cars rather than in production runs. And here is the detail that tells you what kind of place this was. The men stayed. Through the liquidation, through the Hurlocks, through the war, and out the other side, the same craftsmen came in through the same gates year after year. There is a documented account of one man who had joined AC in 1919, the year of the balloon factory, the year of the great engine, and who was still there in the middle of the 1970s, more than half a century later, sitting at his bench and hand-stitching leather seats for AC's cars. His name has not survived in the records. His loyalty has. That is what Thames Ditton was in the years before the storm. A gentle, careful, family firm, staffed by men who gave it their working lives, building a handful of exquisite cars a year on the banks of a quiet river. It was about to be handed a chassis that would change the world, and it would cost them £5. Chapter 3. A chassis worth £5. The chassis didn't come from AC at all. It came from a freelance engineer working out of a shed, and it came into the world wearing someone else's clothes. The engineer was John Togero, a quiet, gifted designer who built lightweight racing specials for well-heeled club racers. In 1953, one of those racers, a flamboyant character named Cliff Davis, commissioned Togero to build him a sports racing car for the season. Togero built the running gear. The body was beaten out of aluminium as an almost shameless copy of the Ferrari 166 Barchetta, the little Italian roadster that was, at that moment, the most beautiful thing on four wheels. They registered the car, gave it the number plate LOI 500, and sent Davis out to race it. He won. Again and again. 6 victories in that one season, in a home-built special wearing a borrowed Italian shape. And people noticed. What made the car work was underneath the pretty skin. Togero's chassis was elegant in its simplicity. 2 large steel tubes running the length of the car, independent suspension at all 4 corners by transverse leaf springs, rack and pinion steering, and very little weight anywhere. It was clever the way the best engineering is clever, which is to say, it looked obvious once someone else had thought of it. Togero took one of his cars along to Thames Ditton. Charles Hurlock looked at it, drove it, and understood immediately what he was seeing. Here was the modern, competitive sports car his gentle old firm needed, and it already existed. He bought the design. Then the craftsman went to work. AC's development man, Vin Davison, refined the prototype together with Togero, and they dropped in AC's own 2-litre Weller Straight 6, the engine John Weller had drawn back in 1919, still earning its keep 3 decades on. AC's Alan Turner styled the production bodywork, softening the Ferrari Echo into something that was finally, properly, AC's own. And a bodyman named Eric George Gray beat that shape out of aluminium by hand. For all of this, for the design that gave the firm its future, John Togero was paid a royalty of £5 per car. £5. There is the whole story in miniature if you want it. The delicate economics of a tiny firm, the modesty of the men who made these things, the enormous value that would one day be built on a foundation somebody had signed away for the price of a good dinner. They called the car the AC Ace, and they showed it at the London Motor Show in October 1953. Production began the following May. It was lithe and low and lovely, and it drove better than it had any right to. Then, in 1956, it got the heart it deserved. At the urging of a racer and AC agent named Ken Rudd, the firm offered a Bristol engine, a 2-litre straight 6 descended from a pre-war BMW design, good for around 120 to 130 horsepower. In a car this light, that was transformative. There was a Ford-engined version too, later, though only 37 customers ever took it. The Ace, with the Bristol engine, was no longer just a pretty roadster for gentlemen. It was a giant killer. Roughly 223 AC-engined Aces were built, and around 466 with the Bristol engine, and they went out, and they raced, and they won. They took American club championships year after year, and then they did something that mattered far more than any club trophy. In June 1959, 2 men named Ken Rudd and John Turner took an ace to the 24 Hours of Le Mans, finished first in their class and 7th overall against the fastest machinery in the world, and then drove the thing home. It was so close to a standard production car that it could average around 95 miles an hour for a full day and night on the great French circuit and still be a car you could use on the road. That result lodged the little British roadster in a great many minds, but it lodged most firmly in the mind of one particular man, because that very same weekend, at that very same race, that man had won the whole thing outright. He was a lanky, drawling Texan with a bad heart and a talent for making things happen, and he was about to come looking for a chassis. Chapter 4: The Failed Chicken Farmer. Carroll Shelby liked to introduce himself as a failed chicken farmer, and he meant it as a compliment to himself. He was born in Leesburg, Texas, in January 1923, the son of a rural mail carrier. He flew in the war, a US Army Air Force's flight instructor and test pilot, and came out of it looking for something to do with a life that felt too big for a small Texas town. He tried the chicken business. It went bankrupt. He tried a few other things. They didn't take either, and then, in 1952, almost on a dare, he drove a friend's hot rod in a local race and discovered the one thing on earth he was extraordinary at. He rose fast, impossibly fast for a man who'd started so late. By 1954, he was driving for John Wyer's Aston Martin factory team in Europe, running against the best in the world. That same year, in the murderous Carrera Panamericana road race across Mexico, he crashed hard and broke himself up badly. He raced again the following season anyway, with his arm still in a cast, taped to the steering wheel so he could hold the thing straight, Sports Illustrated named him Driver of the Year in 1956 and again in 1957. He raced Ferraris and Maseratis and beat men who'd been doing it their whole lives. Then came his greatest day. On the 21st of June, 1959, sharing an Aston Martin with the Englishman Roy Salvadori, Carroll Shelby won the 24 Hours of Le Mans. The same race, the same weekend, that a little AC ace had just driven to a class win. He was the second American-born driver ever to win the race, and he did it with a secret in his mouth. Shelby had a congenital heart condition, and to hold off the crippling chest pain of angina, he raced with nitroglycerin tablets tucked under his tongue. You cannot do that forever. The heart won the argument. In 1960, after taking one more American sports car championship, Shelby's doctors told him he was finished as a driver, and he was. He was 37. Most men at that point would have gone home. Shelby moved to Southern California instead, opened a Goodyear racing tire distributorship and a high-performance driving school, and turned the whole of his considerable will toward a single obsession. He wanted to build a sports car, an American sports car with a big American V8 in the nose that could go to Europe and beat the Italians on their own ground. He had the reputation, the contacts, and the showman's gift for making people believe. What he did not have was a car. He needed a light, well-sorted chassis. He needed it cheap, and he needed it now. And thousands of miles away, in a gentle Surrey village, a small, proud firm had exactly such a chassis, and had just been dealt a blow that threatened to kill it. Chapter 5. A Snake in a Dream. The blow was this. In 1961, Bristol stopped making the six-cylinder engine that had turned the Ace from a pretty car into a great one. Just like that, AC's finest machine had lost its heart. A tiny firm that built a handful of cars a year now had a flagship with a hole where the engine should be. AC needed an engine. Shelby needed a chassis. Somewhere across the Atlantic, the two halves of the same problem were sitting in the dark, not yet knowing about each other. It was an American racer named Ed Hugas, one of the very few men to race Le Mans 10 times, who is said to have pointed Shelby toward Thames Ditton. And in September 1961, Shelby sat down and wrote a letter to Charles Hurlock, proposing something that would have made a more nervous firm show him the door. Let me put an American V8 in your car. Hurlock wrote back in October. He was interested, provided a suitable engine could actually be found. At almost exactly the same moment, the other half of the puzzle fell into place. Through a contact at Hot Rod magazine, Shelby learned that Ford had a brand new, lightweight, thin-wall, small-block V8, light enough, compact enough, to fit where a straight six had been. He wrote to a Ford engineer named Dave Evans in Dearborn. Ford, as it happened, was just launching itself into an all-out era of performance and racing, hungry for exactly this kind of story. Evans got Shelby in front of Don Frey, a division general manager who was himself a car enthusiast, and Ford agreed to bankroll the first cars. In September 1961, they shipped Shelby 2 of their new V8s. One of them was sent onward, across the ocean, to a shed by the Thames. And there, in January 1962, AC's craftsmen performed the small miracle that started everything. They took an Ace, strengthened its chassis tubes, moved the steering box to make room, and built the prototype of a new car. Then, in February 1962, they took that car, hand-built, aluminium-bodied, but with no engine and no gearbox in it, and air-freighted it to Los Angeles. Shelby and his friend Dean Moon collected it personally and took it to Moon's workshop in Santa Fe Springs. And there, into that delicate English chassis, they lowered a Ford V8 and bolted up a gearbox in a matter of hours. The thing fired. The thing ran. The most improbable motor car of its age had just come alive on a workshop floor in California, built from parts made 5,500 miles apart by men who had, for the most part, never met. It needed a name. Shelby always told the same story about where it came from, and he told it so often that it became true whether it was or not. The name, he said, came to him in a dream. He woke up, wrote it down, and went back to sleep. Cobra. There was no fleet. There was no factory full of them. There was one car. So Shelby did what a natural showman does. He lied beautifully. He had the single prototype repainted in different colours between magazine visits, so that motoring editors would believe production was in full swing. It worked. One writer called it one of the most impressive production sports cars he'd ever driven. The trick, the swagger, The sheer front of it. That was Shelby entire. To build the real thing, he founded Shelby American, working first out of Dean Moon's shop, then out of an old racing works in Venice, then somewhere bigger and bigger again, until within a few years he had over 500 people. He gathered extraordinary talent. Phil Remington, a self-taught engineering genius who could make anything out of anything. Shelby said flatly that he couldn't have done any of it without him. Ken Miles, a wiry, sharp-tongued Englishman who could develop a race car by feel and then go out and win in it. A young designer named Pete Brock, whose moment was still to come. But the cars themselves, the bones of them, still came from Thames Ditton. This is the part the world would forget. Every Cobra began its life in that gentle Surrey village. Derek Hurlock's craftsmen built the chassis and hand-formed the aluminium bodies over wooden bucks, working the metal with the English wheel, smoothing the panels by hand and by eye the way the man stitching seats had done since 1919. Rolling cars, painted and trimmed and beautiful and empty, were crated up and flown to California to have their monstrous American hearts installed. The first 75 cars used the smaller Ford engine. Then came the larger 289 cubic inch version, and with it, real power. And now the strange, magnificent hybrid was ready to do the only thing Carroll Shelby had ever really wanted it to do. It was ready to go racing. It was ready to go after Ferrari. Chapter 6. Beating Enzo. The first race was a promise and a warning at the same time. In October 1962, at Riverside in California, a Cobra took the grid for the first time. It led, and then, out in front, a rear hub failed, and it was gone. That was the pattern of the early days. Blinding speed, undone by parts that hadn't yet caught up with the engine. But the speed was real, and everyone who saw it knew it. The wins came fast once the cars stopped braking. The first victory fell to Dave McDonald at Tucson in March 1963. Then, at Riverside in February, McDonald and Ken Miles brought their Cobras home first and second, side by side, and did it in front of the brand-new Chevrolet Corvette Stingrays, beating America's own sports car on America's own soil. And then, in September 1963 at Bridgehampton, the Cobras scored the win that carried real weight, the first international championship victory ever taken by an American car with an American engine. Dan Gurney and Ken Miles, first and second again. It was glorious. It was also not enough, and Shelby knew it. Because there was a problem, and the problem was shaped like the wind. The Cobra was an open roadster, and an open roadster with the aerodynamics of a barn door. On the tight tracks, it was untouchable. But on the long, fast circuits of Europe, the places where championships were actually decided, the air piled up against that upright windscreen and held the car back, and Ferrari's sleek, closed 250 GTO coupes simply drove away into the distance. To win the world title, the Cobra had to get slippery. The answer came from the youngest man in the building. Pete Brock, barely into his 20s, sketched a radical closed coupe, a low, smooth, cut-off-tailed body wrapped around the Cobra's chassis. It looked strange. The old hands were skeptical. Phil Remington reportedly thought it a waste of time, and it was Ken Miles who fought for the idea. But Brock was right, and the wind proved it. They built just 6 of them. They called them Daytona coupes, and they were, in the flat, they were the fastest thing Shelby American ever made. The coupe won its class on its debut at Sebring in 1964. It won its class and finished 4th overall at Le Mans that summer. And it set up the moment the whole enterprise had been building toward from the first repainted prototype. On the 4th of July 1965, at Reims in France, the Shelby Daytona coupes clinched the World Championship for GT manufacturers. It was the first world motor racing title ever won by an American constructor. They had beaten Ferrari, a firm that had won 10 of the previous 12 GT titles, beaten Enzo at the one thing Enzo had always owned, a tiny English chassis, a big American engine, a Texan's dream, and a young man's coupe, and together they had just conquered the world. Carroll Shelby wasn't even there. By the 4th of July 1965, his attention had already moved on. Ford had a new job for him, a car called the GT40, built for one purpose, to destroy Ferrari outright at Le Mans, and Shelby was already consumed by it. The championship-winning coupes, the fastest cars he'd ever built, were becoming yesterday's news even as they won. And here, at the very summit, is the first cold shadow. To win the right to run the GT40, Shelby had signed away the future of the Daytona program, the very cars that had just made him a world champion. The triumph and the execution order carried the same signature. Nobody standing at Reims that July could have read it that way. But it was already written. And there was one more thing being born in that same golden year, the thing this whole story is named for. The Cobra had been humbled once. At the Nassau Speed Week, a monstrous aluminium-bodied Corvette Grand Sport had made the Cobras look ordinary, and Shelby was not a man who forgot a public embarrassment. The answer was brute force. Ken Miles took a Cobra and jammed a huge iron Ford engine into it just to feel what the chassis would do. Shelby drove it himself. And then, working with Ford and with the craftsmen back at Thames Ditton, they built something new and frightening. They tore up the delicate original. The main chassis tubes grew from 3 inches thick to 4. The whole car widened by 5 inches. The gentle transverse leaf springs that John Togero had drawn for a light little roadster were thrown out and replaced with proper coil springs and wishbones, because the old suspension could not begin to cope with what was coming. And what was coming was the Ford 7-litre, 427 cubic inches, something like 425 horsepower on the street and closer to 485 in anger, dropped into a 2-seater that weighed almost nothing at all. A delicate British sports car, born of a design worth £5 and built by loyal men in a Surrey balloon factory, had just been turned into one of the most savagely overpowered machines the road had ever seen. In 1965, at the very height of it all, the World Championship in hand and Ferrari beaten, the monster was ready. They didn't know it yet, but this was the summit. This was as high as it would ever go, and from a summit, there is only one direction left to travel. Chapter 7. The Widowmaker. To understand why the car earned the name it did, you have to understand what they had actually built. Take a 2-seater with a wheelbase of just 90 inches, short, stubby, nimble. Put 600 pounds of iron V8 over the front wheels. Give it something like 485 horsepower in full cry, and give the driver almost nothing to help him manage it. No traction control, because the phrase didn't exist. No electronic aids of any kind. Just a throttle pedal wired to a volcano and a pair of hands. On a dry road, in the hands of a Ken Miles, it was the fastest thing alive. In the wet, or in the hands of a man who thought his ability matched his bank balance, it was something else. The grip would hold and hold and hold, right up to the edge, and then let go all at once, without warning, the tail coming round faster than most people could think. Modern testers still climb out of these cars pale. They still say the same things: nose heavy, plan your moves well ahead, wear a harness, wear a helmet. They called it the Widowmaker, and the name stuck hardest to the big block 7-litre cars. It was, if we're honest, a reputation grafted onto real crashes rather than a single measured fact. But it was earned in blood often enough that nobody argued. The numbers were absurd for the age. 0 to 60 in a little over 4 seconds on street tyres, which is quick even now and was science fiction then. A quarter mile in the low 12s. A top speed around 165. But the number that made the legend was a stopping number. In a road test in late 1965, Ken Miles took a big block Cobra and ran it from a standstill to 100 miles an hour and back to a standstill in about 13.8 seconds. It was a record, and it gave the world the line that follows the Cobra to this day, that the thing could stop from 100 faster than most cars could reach 60. And then there was the SC. This is where the triumph curdled, quietly, into the first real failure. To race the 7-litre car in international competition in 1965, Shelby needed to build 100 of them, 100 cars to satisfy the rulebook and homologate the design. He didn't make it. He built somewhere around 53 to 56 by the deadline, roughly half of what was required, and the governing body refused him. In a single stroke, Shelby was left holding a batch of savage competition cars that were now unraceable, and being stripped-out racing machines very nearly unsaleable too. So, they improvised. They took 31 of these unsold competition roadsters, bolted on windscreens and bumpers and mufflers, detuned them a fraction, and sold them to the public as road cars. The 427 SC, they called it, semi-competition. Street legal race cars, sold because nobody could think what else to do with them. It was a fix born of failure. And here is the bitter joke of it. Because they were, in truth, undomesticated racers, wearing the thinnest disguise, they became the most coveted, most valuable Cobras ever made. The failure created the treasure. Nobody planned that. Nobody could have. The purest, most frightening expression of the whole idea was a car Shelby built for himself. He took a 7-litre Cobra and fitted it with not one but 2 Paxton superchargers, forcing the engine to breathe far beyond anything it was designed for. He built 2. Only one survives. He called it the Super Snake, and he said plainly that he'd wanted the fastest, meanest car on the road. He got it. The comedian Bill Cosby bought one, tried to drive it, and reportedly gave up. The car simply beyond him. It passed to a man named Tony Maxey. Maxey lost control of it, ran off the road, and went over a cliff into the Pacific Ocean. The most powerful Cobra ever built, doing exactly what its name always threatened to do. That was the peak of the danger, and the peak of the legend. But peaks, in this story, are always the edge of something falling. And 1966, the year after the championship, the year of the Widowmaker at full cry, was the year it all began to end. Chapter 8. The Empty Bay. The end of the Cobra didn't come as a crash or a scandal. It came as a series of quiet, reasonable decisions made by busy men who had bigger things on their minds. The biggest of those things was the GT40. Ford wanted Ferrari destroyed at Le Mans, wanted it more than it wanted anything, and Shelby American was the tool chosen to do it. That took everything: the people, the money, the attention. And it worked. In June 1966, Ford's cars came home first, second, and third at Le Mans, a total humiliation of Enzo Ferrari on the world's greatest stage. But the man who had done more than anyone to make those cars fast was cheated of the moment. Ken Miles had led that race. Miles, the sharp-tongued Englishman who had developed the Cobra, developed the GT40, driven the first big block mule to teach the chassis what it needed, was out in front and on his way to winning the greatest race on Earth. And then Ford's management, wanting a photograph of all 3 cars crossing the line together, ordered him to slow and let the others catch up. He obeyed. The staged finish cost him the win on a technicality. He had won the race and been handed a footnote. 2 months later, on the 17th of August 1966, Ken Miles was killed. He was testing Ford's next car, the J car, at Riverside. It crashed and it broke apart, and he died at 47. The man who had made the fastest cars in the world killed by one of them, at the very height of the enterprise's fame. The best driver-engineer any of them had ever known, gone in an afternoon. The Cobra outlived him by 4 months. The last of the great 7-litre cars, chassis number 3360, was built on the 14th of December 1966. The very last unit of all was invoiced to a Ford dealer the following October, and then there were no more. Why did it stop? Not one reason. Several, each of them a reasonable business decision, each of them a small nail. Ford's attention had moved to the Mustang and the far more profitable Shelby GT350 and GT500. Big money, big volume, a real market. New American safety and emissions rules were coming, rules the crude, hand-built, hand-hammered Cobra could never have met without ceasing to be a Cobra at all. The car had always been a low-margin thing, built by hand, sold with difficulty, and the homologation failure had taken away its reason to exist as a racer in the first place. Then, in the spring of 1967, Ford decided to end the Shelby Mustang operation too, citing cost and quality. That August, Shelby's Ford tooling and assets were packed up and shipped back to Dearborn, and Shelby Mustang production moved to Michigan. The Shelby American manufacturing era closed, and with it, quietly, the relationship between Carroll Shelby and the little firm in Surrey closed as well. The flow of rolling chassis across the Atlantic simply stopped. For Carroll Shelby, this was hardly the end of anything. He was richer and more famous than he'd ever been, and he had another 45 years of reinvention ahead of him. Chili recipes, safari tours, consulting on the Dodge Viper, a revived Mustang line, a heart transplant in 1990, and a kidney from his own son a few years later. He would die in 2012 at 89, one of the longest surviving heart transplant patients in the world, a legend many times over. The Texan landed on his feet. He always did. But the town that built the car, the gentle village by the Thames, the loyal craftsman, the firm that had hand-formed every one of those aluminium bodies, the town got no such landing. For AC cars, the American had come, made them briefly the centre of the automotive world, and gone again. And now they were alone, with their beautiful chassis, in a world that was moving on. The greatest thing they had ever been part of was over, and it had left them with a name the world was already beginning to attach to somebody else. The car bay was empty, and AC now had to face the next 40 years by themselves. Chapter 9. 40 Years of Dying. Here is the cruelty at the centre of this story. AC did not die when the Cobra ended. That would almost have been kinder. Instead, it died slowly, by installments, over 4 decades, each attempt to survive a little sadder than the last. The first attempt was rather beautiful. AC took the big 7-litre chassis, stretched it 6 inches, and sent it to Turin to be dressed by the great Italian designer Pietro Frua as an elegant grand tourer. They called it the AC 428. It was gorgeous, and it was hopeless as a business. Bodies shipped all the way to Italy and back, each car built at glacial pace, each one costly. They managed just 81 of them across 8 years. Then the oil crisis of 1973 arrived. Thirsty exotic cars became unsellable overnight, and the 428 quietly died. The firm had spent the Cobra's afterglow on a car almost nobody bought. Then came the disaster that defined the decline, the AC 3000Me. If you want to watch a small, brave firm walk slowly off a cliff over the course of a decade, this is it. It started as someone else's idea, a mid-engined prototype from 2 ex-Ford engineers. AC bought it, developed it into their own mid-engined sports car with a Ford V6 mounted behind the seats, and showed it triumphantly at the London Motor Show in 1973, promising to build it the next year at a price around £3,800. It was modern. It was clever. It was exactly the fresh start they needed. And then everything that could go wrong went wrong, slowly. British Leyland refused to supply the engine they'd wanted, forcing a redesign around the Ford unit. The same 1973 oil crisis that killed the 428 gutted the market for the 3000MA before it was even born. Then, in 1976, new crash safety regulations came in, and the prototype failed the 30-mile-an-hour crash test, forcing a complete redesign of the chassis. The tiny firm passed the test on its second attempt, a genuine achievement when giant Vauxhall had needed several goes with a family hatchback. But the years were bleeding away. The first customers finally took delivery in 1979, 6 years late. 6 years. The world it had been designed for was gone, and now it faced the brilliant new Lotus Esprit. The price, promised at under £4,000, had ballooned past £11,000, and past £13,000 by the time the road testers got hold of one. And after all that, all the years, all the redesigns, all the struggle, the car was merely adequate. 120 miles an hour, 0 to 60 in around 8.5 seconds. Reviewers found fault with the handling when pressed. Against ambitions of 250 cars a year, AC built somewhere around 100, all told, over 5 years. It was a commercial failure of the most exhausting kind, the kind that takes a decade to happen. And in 1984, production of the 3000ME stopped at Thames Ditton. The name and the design were licensed away to a new operation in Glasgow, AC Scotland, which built about 30 more cars before calling in the receivers in 1985. 1 year. That was all it lasted. And so we come to 1986, and to Derek Hurlock, the man we met as a young naval officer joining the family firm in 1939. He was old now, and his health was failing, and the recession was drowning the company his family had run for 56 years. It was Derek Hurlock who called the halt. After the humiliation of the 3000ME, with no way forward, he ended it. The Hurlock family sold up. 56 years of one family's careful stewardship, 75 years of the mark living and breathing at Thames Ditton since the move across the river in 1911. The great engine, the balloon factory, the Ace, the Cobra, the loyal men at their benches, all of it had run through the hands of Weller, then Edge, then 3 Hurlocks. and now it passed out of the family's hands forever, into a future that would treat that proud old name like a parcel to be passed around. The craftsmen didn't all vanish, at least. Many of them moved a few miles to Brooklands, to a Cobra restorer named Brian Anglis, who took on the old jigs and bodybucks and drawings. It's said that even the old sewing machine made the journey from Thames Ditton. The skills were scattered, but not entirely lost. Small mercy, it was the last one AC would get. Chapter 10. The name they fought. Over what happened to AC after 1986 is not really the story of a car company anymore. It's the story of a name, a valuable, famous, contested name, being passed from hand to hand, each owner hoping to make it live again, each one, in the end, letting it go. Brian Anglis went first. His firm, Autocraft, based at the old Brooklands motor racing site, built continuation Cobras using the original tooling and the Thames Ditton craftsman, and he acquired the AC trademark rights. Then, in 1986 and 87, Ford came in, the same Ford that had helped make the Cobra, now taking a majority stake in a joint venture. It should have been a homecoming. It curdled fast. The relationship soured so badly that Ford reportedly tried to wind up or close AC on 6 separate occasions in the early 1990s, before selling its share back to Anglis in 1992. Anglis tried again. He launched a new AC Ace in the mid-90s, hand-built, aluminium-bodied, a proper car, but it was expensive and almost certainly lost money on every example, and only around 46 to 50 were ever made. To keep the doors open, Brian Anglis sold his own motorcycle collection and a vintage Bentley. Think about that. A man selling his personal treasures, one at a time, to keep a name alive. In 1996, Autocraft went into receivership. Then it was Pride Automotive, and the trademarks moving to a holding company. Then Alan Lubinsky, a South African-born businessman who built a handful of cars and struck a deal with Carroll Shelby's own company to build an authentic Shelby Cobra, a deal that collapsed into a lawsuit. Lubinsky moved some production to Malta, where perhaps 3 cars were built before it closed. Since 2009, the name has been licensed to a German firm building a modern Cobra with a Chevrolet engine, while a separate heritage operation at Brooklands builds continuation, Aces and Cobras for collectors. Anglis, Ford, Pride, Lubinsky, Germany. A proud old mark reduced to a license, a logo, a thing that lawyers argue over, and argue they did, right up to the present. In 2022 and 2023, the whole tangled question of who owned what came to a head in the High Court, in a battle over the Cobra name and shape between AC's owners and a British dealer backed by Carroll Shelby's licensing company. The outcome, when it came, was almost poetic in its sadness. AC withdrew its main infringement claim just before trial. The registered designs protecting the Cobra's very shape were revoked, and the name itself was, in effect, split down the middle of the Atlantic. AC Cars keeping the AC Cobra trademark in Britain, while the Shelby Cobra name went the other way, the Texan and the town. Even now, 60 years on, they cannot agree on who the car belonged to, and the courts, in the end, decided that it belonged to both and neither. One name, cut in half, one half for each side of the ocean it was born across. Chapter 11. What Remains. Go to Thames Ditton today, and you'll find one of the pleasanter corners of Surrey. It's a conservation village now, prosperous and quiet, the sort of place that successfully avoided extensive post-war redevelopment, which is the estate agent's way of saying it's lovely and it's expensive. The old High Street Works was sold and redeveloped. The Riverside Ferry Works building, a Victorian factory where the Cobra's chassis first took shape, still stands. But its commercial offices now, let out at a rent of nearly £400,000 a year. The birthplace of the Widowmaker is somebody's smart office space by the water. There is no monument to what was made here, no plaque worth the name. Walk past on a Sunday, with the pubs busy and the river slow, and nothing tells you that the fastest, most frightening car of its age was born in the shed you've just walked by, built by men whose names have mostly slipped out of the record entirely. And here is the reversal that makes the whole thing ache. Those cars, the ones nobody wanted to buy new, the ones Shelby had to repaint and lie about to shift, the ones that struggled to find buyers at $6,000 or $7,000, those cars are now among the most valuable machines on Earth. In August 2016, the very first Cobra, chassis 2000, Shelby's own car, the one repainted in a dozen colours to fake a fleet. That car sold at auction for $13,750,000. At the time, the most expensive American car ever sold. Shelby's twin supercharged Super Snake has changed hands for $5.5 million. A genuine SC, one of those failures, those unsaleable races with bumpers bolted on in desperation, will now fetch $2 or $3 million and more. A 1966 Cobra that sold for $250,000 in 1987 made $2.4 million in 2019. The car that couldn't be given away became the car that couldn't be afforded, and the world remembers it. In 2019, a film called Ford v Ferrari, Matt Damon as Shelby, Christian Bale as Ken Miles, took over $225 million at the box office and won 2 Academy Awards, and sent a whole new generation off in search of Cobras. The car is routinely called the most replicated in automotive history. There is a vast global industry building copies of it, the sincerest tribute there is. But look at what the world remembers, and who. It remembers the Cobra. It remembers Shelby, the failed chicken farmer who won Le Mans and beat Ferrari. It remembers now poor Ken Miles, robbed of his win and killed 2 months later. It remembers Texas and California and the roar of a Ford V8. It does not mostly remember Thames Ditton. It does not remember John Weller drawing an engine so good it ran for 44 years. It does not remember the Hurlocks, who bought a warehouse and accidentally saved a car company and gave it 56 years of careful, determined respectability. It does not remember John Torrero, who designed the chassis for the price of a good dinner. It does not remember the man who joined in 1919 and was still stitching leather seats by hand in the 1970s, giving a lifetime to a firm that the world would forget. That is the true tragedy here, underneath all the speed and the noise and the millions. A delicate, beautiful British sports car, drawn up for £5 a copy and built by loyal men in an old balloon factory, was saved by a Texan who filled it with a monstrous engine and made it immortal. And in making it immortal, he guaranteed that the world would remember him and forget them. The car lives on, worth a fortune, roaring through films and dreams and the memories of men who never even drove one. And the town that built it sits quiet by the river, its work finished, its name split in two and fought over in a courtroom, its craftsman gone. The engine is silent, the bay is empty, and the river runs on past the office windows, exactly as it always did, carrying nothing, remembering nothing, opposite the palace, in the gentlest place in England.